In case you are lucky enough not to have seen yet, there are these two BreadTubers who had this massive dumpster fire of a debate recently. The first is Vaush, or Ian Kaczynski, who is a market libertarian socialist, and the other is American Johnson, or NonCompete, who is an anarcho-communist with a lot of Marxist characteristics. All of this occurring after repeated attacks from the former on the latter's Vietnamese Marxist-Leninist wife, Luna Oy. However, in the broader scheme of things, this seems to be part of a larger drama involving such personalities as Professor Flowers, Fort Slime, and Bad Mouse, among others. Seemingly most of the streaming community has mobilized behind Vaush, whereas the video essayists have risen in defense of EJ and Luna. Now, because this seems to be quite prescient on the left at the moment, and because I'm precisely the kind of person that they're talking about, i.e. an idealist, I thought I would give some thoughts. Both sides are not completely wrong as such about idealism and dialectical materialism, but neither are entirely right either. EJ is admittedly somewhat less wrong, but still is a little too uncharitable to idealism. Vaush seems to understand both concepts in a very specific way, and when presented with each in a slightly different way, seems to jump to conclusions with varying accuracy. For each of the points that we will consider in this video, I shall try to paraphrase to the best of my ability the argumentation of the persons concerned. You'll see it on screen, and then I'll give my thoughts. I'm going to give this first round a tie. EJ is describing moral relativism, but is right to see this relativism, at least in part, as a product of diverging material conditions and social conflict theory. This can indeed, therefore, be seen through dialectical materialism, but Vaush is partially right that dialectical materialism has its limits here too. Justifying why we ought to care about other people's interests in the first place does require a degree of thinking beyond simply the dialectical model. Ultimately, EJ overplays dialectical materialism's role in determining ethics, leaving out conscious will, whereas Vaush underplays it. I believe personally that some level of abstract thought or interpretation will always be necessary to translate the descriptive into the prescriptive, and hence I do think that dialectical materialism only takes you so far here. Subjective ethical systems, however implicit, will inevitably come into play, although this doesn't inherently beget any need to universalize or codify this thought process, as Vaush claims. Intuition and adaptability within ethical frameworks are important in avoiding dogma. Personally, I am therefore a cultural relativist like EJ, but still believe a degree of indefinable subjectivity to be inherent to any designation of morality, and unless you can purely objectively define that subjectivity somehow, that makes my position idealist. Vaush's position is also idealist here, but one that is not cultural relativist, based instead on the premise that Vaush's personal philosophy would be the objectively right one for all situations and persons. Both EJ and Vaush therefore have the same issue here, over-objectification of ultimately subjective variables. For Vaush, I recommend you read up on cultural relativism. For EJ, I recommend you look into post-structuralism and the elusiveness of trying to quote-unquote define or objectify subjectivity, even in aspects as basic as perception or communication. Hard win for EJ here. No, dialectical materialism is not just historical materialism. EJ and Luna's given definitions are indeed pretty decent on these topics. Dialectical materialism does indeed concern the formation of arguments, ideas, and ideology about the world from the interaction of usually conflicting material conditions. Marxism posits this general formula of material thesis and antithesis with ideological synthesis as a universal truth. This goes beyond simply the application to historical development, which posits conflicting material conditions within class societies, inevitably giving rise to class interests and class war, hence revolutionary development. What Vaush is describing is more partial materialism, in essence that it's worth considering that material conditions may be responsible for certain people doing certain things. But this is not inherently dialectical unless placed into a formulaic thesis, antithesis, synthesis structure, and is taken as an objective scientific underpinning for all syntheses itself. Vaush would be correct to see this prospect as outdated and nowadays untenable, but that would be a more truthful description of the concept in question nonetheless. You can absolutely make decisions with more or less reference to the conditions you are in, although a hardline proponent of dialectical materialism would probably see this as already determined. Therefore, while dialectical materialism absolutely still concerns what one does, it would exist behind conscious choice as opposed to as conscious choice. Such determinist perspectives seem to be accepted by neither of the two debaters nor myself, and for good reason. The calculation of objective consequence requires no tainting of material conditions with any unobjectifiable subjectivity in perception or rationalization, a prospect which post-structuralist theory has rendered mostly obsolete. Again, EJ's slightly more nuanced take here is more accurate than Vaush's slightly reductive one. EJ's point is one that I mostly agree with, that being that you can't really divorce an ethical judgment or a societal structure from the given context around it, and you can't, as Vaush might propose, evaluate it in a vacuum. EJ does, however, fall into the trap of assuming that this means context objectively determines that judgment or structure, and that there is no potential subjective variable at play that cannot be eventually boiled down into an objective universal formula in its root. As such, EJ is right to say that trying to design ethical or political systems through philosophizing ultimately is seeking truths from abstraction, as opposed to having material stimuli for those ideas. Then again, a hardline dialectical materialist could argue that any proposed abstraction in the first place is already determined by material conditions, in which case EJ isn't necessarily correct. We wouldn't, in this definition, be able to choose to source ideas from abstraction or reality, as true abstraction would actually be impossible for a human agent to ascertain. Vaush, therefore, in a roundabout sense, could actually be considered correct, that abstract philosophy actually fits into the dialectic as an ideological synthesis. But in order for him to be correct, one would have to take the hardline determinist interpretation of dialectical materialism, which both Vaush and EJ have avoided doing as aforementioned. While Vaush may be less accurate on dialectical materialism on this point, I would agree that he is right to attach value to hypothetical thought and philosophy. If we are to accept that human interpretation is inescapably conditioned by subjectivities that are not ultimately objective in their formulation, then we would by consequence be able to use abstract thinking and conceptualized ideals to frame our response to the material world effectively. This would be both utopian and idealistic, but there'd be nothing wrong with it. Vaush wins this one. To imply that Marx's contribution to leftism was not mostly a product of sitting around writing, well, it would be a stretch to say the least. Marx was indeed a philosopher, although it would be definitely arguable that he was, in a sense, a critic of relying on philosophy to structure and design world systems, for material conditions would be the ultimate deciding forces. Vaush's utilitarian axiom would have therefore probably been viewed by Marx as a product of Vaush's material objectivities, but not actually much of any consequence to a revolution. Revolutions are not inspired or driven primarily by axioms. This makes Marx not an empirical positivist either, as he did believe in the creation of subjectifying factors such as Vaush's ideological principles, which absolutely impact the world and its material conditions and should be studied. But Marx still saw all of these things as ultimately scientifically derivable from a material empirical root. We could therefore term Marx as an empiricist with extrapolations. Trying to insist that Marx didn't posit an empirical science to the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis structure of dialectical materialism would be incorrect, and would also by default make him an idealist if that were true. As we've alluded to, the idealism-materialism question is somewhat of a chicken or egg scenario. Pure empiricists or empirical positivists will insist every truth or anything that affects the world is materially observable, and some hardline idealists may insist that material reality is no more than just one of many illusions, so the material is inconsequential. But most people will see ideas and conditions as mutually influencing one another. This is the dialectical materialist position, and it is my idealist position. However, the difference is that a dialectical materialist sees a deterministically objective dialectical formula behind all said ideas. I reject that reliance on the binary, and as such believe the exact same situation can ultimately produce multiple conclusions based on abstract, perhaps arbitrary, rationalization. I'm more with EJ than Vaush on this one, but both are uncharitable positions. Don't get me wrong, Vaush is undoubtedly a leftist and a socialist, and I do think he has a place within the BreadTube ecosystem of sorts. The sort of debates he does might not be my sort of thing, but they do work very well for a certain audience. So having the rhetorical display against fascism and rightism as part of the leftist playbook can be effective for de-radicalization, bubble bursting, and exposing new arguments to new audiences when there's a debate with a fascist or a rightist that Vaush is doing. Then again, I do feel that this same combative approach, in which Vaush must preserve face and stay unquestionably firm to his principles, is not productive when applied to conversation with other leftists, who may have ideas and perspectives worth considering and reflecting upon. Not only is it a potential catalyst for unnecessary division and toxicity, but it can also cement mischaracterizations that both sides were guilty of within this particular debate. This doesn't necessarily equate to sophistry, and EJ and Luna's behavior even less so, as Vaush does obviously have sincere convictions, although one might wonder that, on occasion, some such convictions can be traced to his stubbornness in the principle he starts a debate with, for better and for worse. Vaush, therefore, is somewhat culpable for the escalation against Luna, simply out of positing a dichotomy in principle between them, instead of interacting rhizomatically, ultimately on the same side, but with personal intersections and divergences. Consequentially speaking, he may have therefore been able, if he had taken a different approach, to lessen abuse on both ends somewhat, although he did not explicitly order the abuse, much of which came from his detractors who hate-watch him and was therefore out of his control anyhow. Could Vaush do better? Sure. Is he an abuser himself here? I wouldn't say so at all. Luna did, for reference, criticize Vaush herself in the past prior to this saga, to which she was an instigator, although I feel that this was in a more tentative way as opposed to a condemnation. Obviously, she changed her tune to condemnation after Vaush did so, though, and that wasn't particularly productive on her part either. And finally, Vaush isn't a paedophile. Anyone who suggests such is opportunistically taking a very tenuous, uncharitable, and decontextualized reading of his previous comments. Maybe he could have phrased his thought experiments better away from this sensitive topic, but implying that he is a paedophile, as Luna sort of did, is very unhelpful and low. EJ minus the anti-idealist stuff. As previously touched upon, debate and discussion can absolutely and should absolutely be held amongst ourselves within the left. However, there should be a large difference between debate with differing valid perspectives still oriented towards social justice and debate with a political perspective aiming to destroy this movement. We do need a degree of coexistence on the left of divergent opinions and experiences in a way that we should not strive for coexistence with fascists, and this should mean that we ought to approach other leftists with more charitability than an interrogative rhetorical attack. Being charitable is a necessity for the left, those who aim to establish an egalitarian collective society, as we are by no means epistemologically identical. Quote-unquote tankies are not one cohesive group. Some are merely leftists who preoccupy themselves a little more with re-evaluation of certain pieces of historical consensus. Some are leftists who see use in authority to resist imperialism or take inspiration from figures like Lenin and Mao and their theories. And some clearly harbour reactionary, class reductionist or anti-egalitarian positions, and those people definitely do need to be challenged or excised. But Luna and Flowers both have nuanced, informed perspectives, as well as their own personal biases, sure, and are committed to a fundamentally leftist end goal. Therefore, I do think there is a place for them still on the left. Similarly, idealist socialists and utopian communists, like myself, are similarly committed to a shared goal and deserve to be heard in the discussion as to how to get there. If the left is anything, it is a general consensus on principled objectives, not a consensus on how to go about doing so. Both are heavily uncharitable, so it's a dishonourable tie for this final round. Ultimately, Vaush's well-known stubbornness and fixation with winning has pushed him into some suboptimal quotes in the past, in an attempt to prove his logical consistency instead of investigating the nuances of the original principle he took at the beginning of the debate. This is not new, and arguably is part of the fuel for accusations of pedophilic apologism, despite any accusations being clearly unsubstantiated. Similarly, it is clear here that he was merely playing devil's advocate to invoke the Socratic method, and so to call him a proponent of Nazi ideology would be contextually untenable. EJ could have handled this better. In this particular thought experiment, Vaush used a soundbite that, proportionally speaking, a lot of Jewish people were in the banking sector in Weimar Germany. This may have been true, but it is nonetheless a misleading statistic, as it is irrelevant as to whether Jews controlled the banks, which is what EJ identified as the incorrect premise of Nazi ideological narrative. Therefore, in playing devil's advocate, Vaush did implicitly suggest that this statistic could be a valid link to Nazi rationalization, which is dangerously, misleadingly ideological. He should not have raised this, even if solely for EJ to rebut, given its potentially dangerous capacity. EJ and Luna weren't implying that the Nazis had a point either, as the distortion of Nazi premises does indeed directly relate to the warped ethics which ultimately they used to justify atrocity. EJ and Luna would be correct that you cannot evaluate an ethical prescription in a vacuum. Genocide was a distinct extrapolation of a fallacious worldview, whereas it never would be of an accurate worldview. It should be honestly pretty obvious that neither side are Nazi sympathizers from any contextualized viewing, so we'll leave this one there. Thanks for watching. These opinions are my own, and of course I do not claim to be an expert on this particular drama, or Vaush, or NonCompete specifically. I just happen to be someone who is often involved in the debate that they happen to be discussing, namely that concerning idealism and dialectical materialism. I hope you found some of my reflections of use, and goodbye.